Shaquille O'Neal was a billionaire, a CEO, a legend, but all it took was one quiet janitor to unravel everything he thought he knew. When Big Shaq followed Miss Clarice Monroe home, he wasn't chasing curiosity. He was walking straight into a buried truth the city spent 50 years hiding. Behind her silence lived a son, erased, a husband vanished, and a system built to forget them both. Now power meets conscience, and justice comes knocking where boardrooms never dared to look. Some stories clean the surface. This one scrubs the soul. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Most billionaires fly above the world. Shaq walked through it, and never forgot how the ground felt. Shaquille O'Neal was known to the world as Big Shaq, not just because of the courts he once ruled, or the billions his ventures had stacked since, but because of the weight of character he carried without ever boasting. In a skyline cluttered with egos and unreachable floors, Shaq stayed close to the sidewalk. While his name shone across skyscrapers, he still preferred the narrow streets where the lights flickered, where people looked you in the eye, and where a handshake still meant something. At 53, he had it all. Private jets, multiple homes, a company spanning luxury hotels and tech-integrated smart housing. Yet on most days, Shaq still drove himself to work in a matte black pickup truck that didn't turn heads unless you recognized the man behind the wheel. There was no chauffeur, no flashy security detail, just Shaq, dressed in a navy hoodie and slacks, rolling up with a coffee from a gas station instead of some marble counter cafe. He greeted the parking lot attendant by name. Always had. Vernon had been there 20 years. Shaq never missed his birthday. Inside his corporate HQ, a glass and steel beast with smart elevators and AI-powered everything, Shaq moved like someone who didn't belong to the top floor. He spent his first 15 minutes every morning walking the halls, ducking into the cafeteria, cracking jokes with kitchen staff, tapping shoulders, dishing out grins like currency. He didn't float above the machine. He lived inside it, among the gears. But not everything was as seamless as it looked. For all the warmth Shaq radiated, there was a quiet space inside him that hadn't been filled, not by money, not by fame, not even by the causes he backed. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a low, constant tug, a whisper that there was more to see, more to understand, something left unfinished. He didn't talk about it, not even with his mother, Lucille, whose wisdom grounded him like no board of directors ever could, but he felt it, in the silence after the speeches, in the faces that smiled back at him but held something back. And then there was her, the cleaning lady. He didn't know her name at first. She always came in just before midday, carrying an old canvas bag, her uniform pressed but faded, her posture upright like she'd once stood in front of something bigger than these walls. She wasn't like the others. While most greeted him with nods or warmth, she kept her eyes low, moved with intention, spoke to no one. She wasn't unfriendly, just unreadable. Shaq noticed that when she worked in a hallway, it fell quiet. People stepped around her like she wasn't there. Some whispered things he didn't like. He'd tried once, casually, to greet her. Just a simple, "Good morning, ma'am," as she wiped down a glass wall in Conference B. She didn't respond, didn't flinch, just kept cleaning, her gaze fixed beyond the cityscape that window framed. It wasn't disrespect. It felt more like withdrawal, as if the world had taught her not to engage. Shaq let it go, for a while, but it started to gnaw at him, not out of ego. He didn't care whether someone recognized him or not. It was the way she was treated, like a ghost. He began noticing more, how the younger execs barely acknowledged her, how one intern bumped into her and didn't say sorry, how someone once referred to her as the old mop ghost. Shaq had clocked the man, not with fists, but with a look that cut through his soul. Still, she came in every day, same time, cleaned the same halls, offices, and break rooms. Always precise, always quiet. It didn't add up. Who was she? One Thursday, Shaq lingered longer than usual in the hall where she worked, pretended to be on a call. She wiped the same glass wall as before. He watched her reflection in the pane, watched her pause for just a second, her fingers brushing the pocket of her apron. Inside was something, a small worn photograph, just the corner visible, but enough to catch a glimpse of a child's smile, and what looked like a courthouse in the background. That image stuck with him. Later that day, Shaq asked HR for her employee file. Just curiosity, he told himself. The file they gave him was thinner than a parking ticket, hired 3 years ago through a third-party cleaning service. No address listed, just a P.O. box, no emergency contact. Date of birth estimated. A note about minimal interaction preference, no social media presence, no email. It was as if she lived only between the walls of the office and nowhere else. That night, Shaq sat in his home, 8,000 square feet of silence and polished floors, staring at the fireplace, trying to remember the last time something had genuinely unsettled him. It wasn't fear, it was empathy. The next morning, he found her again in the same hallway. This time he walked past her, slow, purposeful, and left a folded note on the desk she was cleaning. He didn't say a word. The note read, "If you ever need anything, I'm not a CEO in that moment. I'm just a man. You can count on that." She never replied. But 2 days later, he saw something different. She looked up just for a second and nodded once. Not a smile, but acknowledgement. That tiny moment struck Shaq deeper than any award or deal. From that day, he started timing his schedule to match her route, watched her without being intrusive, noticed how her eyes paused on the security guard's TV screen whenever civil rights news played, how she lingered by the memorial wall in the lobby, the one that listed donor names to a justice initiative Shaq had funded a decade ago. Her fingers had once touched the etched name Gregory L. Creed, a second too long. Shaq made a mental note. He also noticed something else. She exited through the loading dock, never took the main exit, never joined the break room meals, even when food was left out for everyone. She worked, left, and disappeared like fog. And still, she came back. By the end of the week, Shaq no longer saw her as just the cleaning lady. She was something else, a puzzle with history carved into its edges. And the whisper inside him, the one he'd ignored for years, had found its voice again. It said, "Follow her." Not for drama, not for answers, but because sometimes when a soul walks quietly through your empire, they're not just passing by, they're inviting you into a truth you've never dared to hear. And Shaquille O'Neal was ready to listen. She moved like a shadow, but carried storms in her silence. Shaq had seen her for months, maybe longer. He'd passed her countless times in the halls and corners of his empire. Miss Clarice Monroe, the woman who moved like she belonged to a different era, a ghost of another fight. She didn't speak, didn't pause, didn't allow anyone into her space. And yet she wasn't invisible, not to Shaq. She was like a book sealed shut, collecting dust on a shelf no one dared to touch, but if opened could rewrite everything. She had a way of standing still that felt louder than motion. She didn't shuffle like some older folks did. She stood erect, a quiet defiance in her posture. Her uniform was always neat, pressed without a single wrinkle, though the navy blue fabric had faded over time into something between charcoal and ash. Her hair, gray and tightly curled, was pinned back in a modest bun. Her eyes, however, were the real story. Dark, steady, and watchful. Not fearful, not broken, just contained, like someone had packed too much truth into them and sealed the lid. No one talked to her. Not the interns, not the executives, not even the other cleaning staff. It was like there was an unspoken boundary around her, a line no one dared to cross. Some whispered that she was odd, others said off, but Shaq knew better. He'd grown up in places where people were labeled strange just for carrying pain the world didn't want to see. She came in after lunch most days, like clockwork, worked through the executive wing, then down the back stairwell to the older floor levels that hadn't been renovated yet. Shaq began noticing her route. He never meant to track it, but he found himself aligned with her movement, showing up on the 16th floor when she was wiping glass, stepping into the 12th when she vacuumed the hallway rugs. It wasn't deliberate, not at first, just instinct. He noticed she always took her breaks by the windows, not the glass-walled skyline ones. The small, square, overlooked windows that still held the dust of the building's past. She didn't sit, she stood, and every time, she reached into the pocket of her apron and clutched something. The first time he saw it, Shaq was walking by the mailroom. She was by the side window, her back to him. Her hand was tucked into her pocket, gripping a weathered photograph like it was a lifeline. He paused unseen and glimpsed part of the picture as she brought it to her lips briefly, whispering something too faint to hear. In that moment, Shaq knew this wasn't just a woman working to survive. She was someone carrying a wound so old and deep, the world had stopped trying to notice it. That night, he asked HR for her full record again. Same result, barely anything. Just a name, Clarice Monroe, estimated age 72, hired through a third-party cleaning service based out of Savannah. No birth date listed, no phone number, no emergency contact. The file was so thin it almost mocked him. She wasn't on social media, didn't have a registered address in their city database. The only thing they had on her, besides her uniform size and security clearance, was her signature on a line that read, "Do not contact me outside of work hours under any circumstances." Shaq stared at the line, longer than he should have. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Back at headquarters the next day, Shaq caught sight of her again. this time in the main lobby just after hours. The cleaning crew was beginning their shift, but Clarice wasn't with them. She stood alone near the Civil Rights Memorial plaque on the far wall. Most people rushed past that plaque, but not her. She stood before it like she'd known the names carved into the steel, as if she had once stood shoulder to shoulder with them, not merely read about them. Her hand again moved to her pocket. Shaq didn't interrupt. Instead, he kept walking, slow enough to glance down at her cart. Among the cleaning supplies sat a tattered paperback book, They Can't Kill Us All. Its spine was cracked, corners curled like it had been read too many times, like it had survived floods and fire. The next few days, Shaq couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just out of concern, but out of a strange sense of duty. He didn't know her story, but he felt its weight. Whatever it wasn't ordinary. And somehow, he felt like he was supposed to find out. On Friday, while walking past the cafeteria, he saw her standing by the rear doors that led to the loading dock. Alone again. Alone again. He slowed his pace, gave a nod. She didn't look up. He waited outside, thinking maybe she would exit soon. Maybe this time, he'd offer her a ride, not to intrude, just to be present. When she finally came out, he followed at a distance. Not to spy, to understand. She walked with purpose, shoulders back, navigating the streets like someone who knew every crack in the pavement. She didn't hail a ride or wait for a bus. She walked 4 blocks to a subway station, took the D line toward the east side. Shaq followed, baseball cap pulled low, no one noticing him except one teenage boy who double-took and then kept walking. She got off near the old Jefferson district, the part of town most CEOs wouldn't dare drive through. Shaq had roots there. It used to be rich in culture, in resilience. Now it was mostly silence and boarded windows. But Clarice didn't hesitate. She walked 2 blocks, entered a red brick building with peeling paint and rusted balcony rails. Shaq waited across the street, inside his truck, windows rolled halfway down. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a sign, maybe just a sense of who she really was when no one was watching. He waited 30 minutes. Then, just before the sun dipped below the roof lines, a small figure appeared in the window on the 5th floor. A child, laughing. A boy, maybe 7, maybe younger. And behind him, Clarice. Shaq froze, his breath caught in his throat. She had a child at home? But she was over 70. The boy couldn't be hers. Clarice came to the window. Her face was softer now, tired but lit in a way he'd never seen at the office. She lifted the boy into her arms, kissed his forehead, and pointed at something in the distance. The skyline, maybe. Then she sat down, her back against the window, and pulled something from her apron pocket. The same photo. Shaq didn't leave right away. He sat with the engine off and a knot tightening in his chest. He realized something then. This wasn't just about her past. It was about her present. Whatever her story was, it hadn't ended. It was still unfolding, quietly, away from the polished walls of his empire. And somehow, she'd brought it right into the heart of his world, without saying a word. Shaq tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, eyes locked on that window 5 floors up. He didn't know who the boy was, didn't know what the photo meant, didn't know why this woman, who carried storms in silence, chose to remain invisible inside the very system she clearly distrusted. But he knew this. The world had forgotten Clarice Monroe. And Shaquille O'Neal was done letting people be forgotten. The richest man in the city tailed a janitor down the subway stairs, not knowing it would haunt him forever. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't a man who believed in secrets, but that day, he became part of one. The air had that strange tension, thick but silent, as if the city itself knew something sacred was about to be uncovered. He'd followed her before from a respectful distance, never close enough to be invasive, but this time something in her posture, something in the way she had quietly clocked out 40 minutes earlier than usual, told him this wasn't part of her routine. She exited the back of the building in her usual gray cardigan, canvas bag slung across her shoulder like a soldier's rucksack. She didn't look around, didn't hesitate. She moved like someone who had done this walk 1,000 times, always unnoticed. Shaq followed, 10 steps behind, blending with the flow of foot traffic. He didn't look back, he didn't think, he just moved. Clarice Monroe turned down Sycamore Avenue, a narrow stretch lined with cracked sidewalks and trees that looked like they hadn't been trimmed since the 80s. Her stride was unbroken. She passed a bakery with dusty windows, a church with a rusted bell, and a laundromat with one machine still chugging inside. She didn't slow, didn't glance at the people she passed. Her focus was a blade. She descended into the subway at 47th and Mason. It was one of those old stations with yellowed tile walls and benches carved with names of people who probably hadn't walked these platforms in decades. The D-line screeched in a few minutes later. She stepped in without pause, settling into the corner of a car. Shaq waited until the doors were almost closing, then slipped in through the next one. He didn't sit. He stood by the opposite end, watching her reflection in the glass. She held the rail with one hand, the other gripping the canvas strap across her chest. Her eyes weren't scanning the train or watching the stations. They were fixed inward, somewhere beyond time. She wasn't just going home. She was returning to something buried. The train ride lasted 22 minutes. She got off at Old Grove Station, a stop that barely saw working professionals. Shaq's last time here had been during his rookie days, when his car broke down during a charity event in the same neighborhood. That was another life. She took the stairs 2 at a time, a surprising urgency in her steps. Shaq gave her space but kept sight. Her path led through Jefferson Ward, a neighborhood once full of jazz bars and cultural murals, now suffocating under gentrification's slow strangulation. The houses were tired. The people looked alert but worn. It wasn't dangerous, just forgotten. Clarice turned onto a side street where the pavement turned to gravel. Half the street lamps were out. At the corner stood a crumbling brick complex with flaking paint and crooked satellite dishes clinging to its edges. The buzzer system had tape over half the buttons. Clarice didn't buzz. She used a key. Shaq slowed as she disappeared through the entrance. A 5th-floor apartment. No elevator. He parked himself on the opposite side of the street beside a rusted-out sedan with no plates and waited. 10 minutes passed. The windows of the building were mostly shut, curtains drawn, except one. 5th floor, far right, where a pale glow leaked through lace drapes. Then it happened. A child's laugh. Shaq straightened. The sound was quick, fleeting, but filled with that unmistakable tone, joy, unguarded and raw. Moments later came a sob. Not the kind of sob you hear in TV dramas. This one was layered, muffled, restrained, decades old. It wasn't grief that was fresh. It was grief that had learned to hide. Shaq's chest tightened. The sound of a child in that apartment raised more questions than answers. Clarice was too old to have a son that age. A grandson, a foster child, a neighbor's kid she watched. None of it made sense. But the sob that belonged to her, that kind of sorrow had lived in silence too long. He stayed until the lights dimmed. By the time he returned home, his mansion felt hollow. The polished floors were too clean, the smart lights too responsive. He moved through his home like a shadow, retracing Clarice's steps in his head. Her silence wasn't apathy, it was protection. Her isolation wasn't accidental, it was chosen. He now knew she didn't avoid people. She avoided harm. The next morning, Shaq was distracted. Meetings blurred, emails were half-read. During a product launch call, he found himself looking out the window, instead of at the digital display. His assistant noticed but said nothing. Shaq wasn't the kind of man you asked twice. Clarice came in for her shift at 12:05. Same uniform, same bag. But something in her eyes had changed. They were red, not from exhaustion, but from the kind of crying that doesn't make noise. She passed Shaq in the hall. For the first time, she looked directly at him. No words, just one long look. It wasn't an invitation, not quite, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was recognition. Of what? Shaq wasn't sure. But it chilled him more than any confrontation ever could. He spent that night pulling every bit of information he could find on Clarice Monroe. But the deeper he searched, the more the trail dissolved. Old tax filings, a birth record with half the details scratched out, and a faint record of a child named Tobias Monroe. No current address, no employment records. The last known public note was from 1997. Sentenced, possession with intent, convicted, no appeal filed. Then it all went dark. That name Tobias triggered something. Shaq sat still, staring at his monitor. The photo, the one he'd seen Clarice holding. The boy's face, the smile. Could it have been him? Shaq leaned back, trying to make sense of it. There was no obituary, no death record, no exoneration. Just stillness, as if someone had pressed pause on a life and never hit play again. The next day, Shaq returned to Old Grove Station. He didn't follow her this time. He went alone. He stood outside the same building, this time during daylight. Kids played soccer with a flat ball near a dumpster. An elderly man watched from his window, face barely visible behind hanging blinds. Shaq waited for over an hour before he saw the same child from the night before, this time stepping out with a small backpack, holding a woman's hand. It wasn't Clarice. It was a young woman, maybe early 30s, with strong features and tired eyes. She looked like someone who had inherited weight she hadn't earned. Shaq didn't approach. He just observed. As they walked past, the boy turned, pointed at Shaq's truck and said something. The woman looked up, made eye contact and paused, for only a second, then kept walking. Back at HQ, Shaq ran the building's resident registry. Unit 5C listed only one name, Clarice Monroe. No other occupants, no children listed, not officially. Something wasn't right. That night, he called his head of internal security, an old friend from his ball days turned compliance chief, Darnell Briscoe. He didn't give specifics, just said, "I need you to pull anything on a man named Tobias Monroe, quietly, and I need it fast." Darnell didn't ask questions. Shaq hung up and walked to the window of his study. From that height, the city looked pristine, organized, but that was always the trick. Pain lived at ground level, and he'd just stepped into it. Whatever truth Clarice was hiding wasn't buried. It was alive. And he had just followed it home. Behind that battered door lived truths that should have stayed buried. The next morning, Shaq didn't wait for instinct. He moved on certainty. He pulled up to the same crumbling red brick building before noon, carrying a grocery bag that didn't quite match his frame. It was something meant to look ordinary, like a neighbor dropping by, not a billionaire CEO trespassing into a stranger's world. The weight of the bag was intentional, filled with basic essentials, eggs, bread, rice, canned peaches, not because she needed them, but because he needed an excuse. He climbed the stairs slowly, all 5 flights, each creak of the old wood beneath him, echoing like an accusation. When he reached the door of Unit 5C, he hesitated. The brass number was barely hanging, the paint peeled around it. He knocked gently. Seconds passed. Then the door cracked open. Just a few inches. Clarice Monroe stood there in her cardigan, eyes sharper than ever. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask why he was there.
"I brought some things,"
Shaq said, lifting the bag. Her eyes dropped to the bag, then back to his face. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. Waited. For a second, he thought she might close the door. But instead, she opened it wider and stepped back. No words, just permission. Shaq stepped inside, and the air changed. The apartment was small, lived in, tidy in the way only older people kept spaces. Deliberate placement of every object, as if every item had earned its right to exist. The walls were thin. He could hear faint traffic outside. A fan buzzed gently in the corner, oscillating across a worn floral couch. But it was the walls that caught him. Lining them were newspaper clippings. Dozens, maybe more. Yellowed and curling at the edges. They weren't random. They were sorted chronologically, many circled or marked with red X's. Headlines that told a story of decades. Young attorney challenges police tactics. NAACP files lawsuit against city. Missing George Monroe. Monroe disbarred post-disappearance. Shaq's eyes scanned them in silence. In the center of it all was a framed photo. Black and white. A young man, tall, serious-eyed, in a courthouse hallway, arm around a woman holding a baby. The woman was unmistakably Clarice, decades younger. The baby, presumably Tobias. "You kept everyone," Shaq finally said, not turning from the wall. "I kept what they tried to erase," Clarice replied, her voice as dry as parchment but strong. She walked into the kitchen and placed a kettle on the old stove. The space was dim, barely lit by the sunlight leaking through sheer curtains. Shaq set the groceries on the counter, watching her move. She didn't shake, didn't struggle, but there was a slowness in her bones, the kind that came from carrying more than just years. Clarice gestured toward the couch. Shaq sat. A moment passed, then another. "You followed me," she said. Shaq didn't deny it. "I did. And now you think you know." He shook his head. "No, but I want to." Clarice leaned against the kitchen doorframe, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But there was no anger, just calculation, like she was measuring the risk of truth against the weight of history. She nodded toward the wall. "That man was my husband, George Monroe, civil rights lawyer, loud mouth, too brave for his own good." Shaq listened. Not just with ears, but posture, breath, every inch of his body tuned to the story unraveling. They came for him in '72, not all at once, piece by piece. Clients started vanishing, evidence gone missing. The night he planned to go public with a report on internal police informants, he never came home, just vanished. No call, no trace. They claimed he ran, left us, but I knew. Her eyes fell to the floor. For the first time, she looked her age. "I went to every station, every judge, marched with his name. You know what they told me? That I was hysterical, that he must have had another life somewhere. They erased him before the grave. Shaq could feel the tension rise like heat from the floorboards. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. What happened to Tobias? Clarice flinched, just slightly. He was 15 when they took him, she said, almost whispering. Said he had drugs in his locker. Said he confessed. You think a boy like that, whose daddy taught him to quote the Constitution before he learned to spell recess, would fold that easy? She stepped away from the wall and picked up another photo. This one of Tobias at maybe 10, smiling wide. A homemade sign behind him that read, Black Futures Matter. The edges were taped and yellowing. They sentenced him at 16, gave him 12 years, no parole, said he was a threat to the community. You know what that meant back then, and probably still means now. Shaq's hands clenched, but he said nothing.
I couldn't visit him.
Not after the first time, Clarice said, sinking into a chair. They treated me like I was the criminal, called me names, searched me like I was smuggling dynamite. Tobias, he stopped writing after 5 years. Then the letters just stopped. She looked up at Shaq. I never got a death certificate. He couldn't find his voice at first. Do you think he's alive? He finally asked. I think they made him disappear just like his father. Quietly, legally, neatly. Her eyes narrowed. The state has ways. Shaq looked at the photo again. He'd seen thousands of faces in his life, from fans to boardroom billionaires. But something about Tobias's smile haunted him. It wasn't just joy, it was conviction. It was a boy who hadn't yet seen what the world would try to do to that light. Clarice stood and walked to a drawer, opening it with a creak. From it she pulled out a folder. It was thin, but what was inside had weight. She handed it to him. Shaq opened it carefully. Inside were carbon copies of Tobias's arrest documents, a court transcript, and one grainy photo of him in a prison jumpsuit. But what struck Shaq most was the last page, a handwritten letter, unsent, addressed to whoever finds the truth. In it, Tobias wrote about a man named Ronald Creed, a prosecutor who pushed for the maximum sentence, who denied appeals, who was later appointed as a federal judge and eventually moved into politics. The letter didn't accuse, it warned. Shaq read it twice. You've had this all these years? He asked, stunned. Clarice gave a tired nod. What good would it do? People forget, papers disappear, and rich men don't want ghosts at their fundraisers. Shaq's jaw tensed. You think I'm one of them? Clarice looked him in the eye. I think you might have been. Until now. There was no accusation, no resentment, just truth. Shaq leaned back on the couch, the walls around him whispering names and dates and protests that never made the evening news. The weight of history wasn't just theoretical here. It was carved into drywall and dust. I can't promise I'll fix it, Shaq said, voice low. But I can promise I won't ignore it. Clarice nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Someone not to look away. They sat in silence for a while, the kettle long cold on the stove. Shaq looked back at the wall of clippings, his eyes landing on one in particular. It was folded, slightly hidden behind another frame. He stood and carefully adjusted the overlaying piece. The headline read, Federal Judge Ronald Creed declines appeal in Monroe v. State. Clarice hadn't X'd that one out. She'd underlined it. The twist wasn't just that George Monroe had been erased, or that Tobias had been silenced. It was that the man responsible was still alive, still powerful, and still untouched. Shaq folded the letter carefully and looked back at Clarice. This man, Creed, he's not just history, is he? Clarice shook her head. He's legacy, built on ours. Shaq stood, the bag of groceries untouched on the counter, the truth now heavier than anything he'd brought in. He didn't need to be a billionaire in that moment. He just needed to be human. And Clarice Monroe had finally let someone listen. She wasn't just a janitor. She was the widow of a man the system tried to erase. Shaq didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, surrounded by silence, but none of it peaceful. The faces in Clarice's apartment followed him. George Monroe, stern and burning with conviction. Young Tobias, his smile too wide for a world so narrow. Clarice herself, moving like someone who knew where the cracks in the foundation were but stayed anyway. The weight of what he'd learned didn't feel like history. It felt like it had just happened, and that it had never really stopped happening. The next morning, instead of going straight to the office, Shaq drove to the old records archive across town. It wasn't digital, that was the point. Places like these held stories that algorithms had forgotten, or deliberately buried. He wasn't just chasing ghosts. He was chasing fingerprints, smudges left by men who'd built power on silenced truth. He gave the clerk the name George Monroe, and waited. The man disappeared into the back, and 20 minutes later returned with a slim brown folder and a skeptical look. "Wasn't easy to find," he said. "Most files from that era either never made it to the new system or went missing." Shaq opened the folder. There wasn't much: a bar association record, a few brief newspaper mentions from 1971 and 1972, and a single typed memo from a law firm dated 3 months before Monroe disappeared. It detailed a case George was working on, a class action suit accusing the city of discriminatory policing and unlawful imprisonment of black minors. The memo was stamped "Intervention Advised" at the top in faded red ink. Shaq read it 3 times. Intervention. The kind of word men in suits used when they didn't want to say shut him down. As he walked out, the sun felt colder. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about the machinery behind Clarice's silence, the institutional erasure, carefully measured and consistently applied. He thought about her cleaning the floor of his boardroom, unknowingly, or maybe knowingly, walking over the same carpet where old decisions had been made to ignore names like her husband's. Back at HQ, Shaq sat in his office with the blinds drawn and Clarice's folder on his desk. He pulled up a building portfolio from 10 years ago, tracing the acquisition records of every commercial property in his company's current empire. On page 9, he froze. The Commerce Bank building, now called the Apex Center, part of his downtown smart hotel conversion, had once been the headquarters of a regional finance institution known for issuing discriminatory home loans, redlining, predatory loans, displacement. And Clarice cleaned there every Thursday afternoon. The irony burned. He pulled up internal memos from the early acquisition phase. One email caught his eye from a former executive who had since retired. It referenced a legacy preservation clause, which exempted the building's historic financial records from public access during renovations. Shaq had never seen that before. His signature was nowhere on it, but his company's name was. He stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the lobby's commemorative wall. Etched there, in gold trim beneath the name of the Apex Center, was a dedication plaque. This building honors the resilience of commerce through decades of transformation. Resilience? Shaq gritted his teeth. That word didn't belong to the men who once ran this place. It belonged to the women scrubbing its floors, to the boys erased by bogus charges, to men like George Monroe who stood up and vanished. He returned to his office, called his general counsel, and demanded a list of every executive who worked on the Apex Center deal: architects, legal advisors, finance officers, PR teams. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. He was Big Shaq. When he asked for something with that edge in his voice, people moved. As the list arrived, another name jumped out. Ronald Creed. Same one from the letter. Same one who'd refused Tobias's appeal. In 1999, Creed had been part of a legal firm advising on post-acquisition compliance during the Apex deal. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a cycle. The same names, reappearing in different roles, always aligned with silence. Shaq leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He had thought his empire was built clean, progressive, tech-integrated, community-forward, but the soil beneath the foundation was soaked in what America never wanted to claim. He called Clarice that evening. She didn't answer. He left a message. "I know about the building. I know who Creed is. I'm not stopping." The next morning, she was waiting outside his office before he arrived. No words at first, just a nod. She stepped inside without invitation, carrying a small envelope. She handed it to him and sat in the guest chair. He opened it. Inside were 4 torn pages from a journal, handwritten, Tobias entries, dated 6 months before his conviction. They described a growing paranoia, men following him home, teachers suddenly accusing him of things he hadn't done, locker checks without reason. One passage read, "Mom says stay calm, but I know it. They're coming. I'm not loud like Dad. I'm not a fighter, but I see what they're doing, and I won't run." Shaq looked up. "You kept this all this time?" Clarice nodded. "You asked if I thought he was alive. I don't know, but I do know this. They never wanted his name to make it past page 2 of any report, just like his father." Shaq ran a hand over his bald head and exhaled hard. "The same men who buried your husband were still writing contracts for my company. I let them in." Clarice's voice was steady. "You didn't let them in. They never left." That night, Shaq stood at the Apex Center alone. He had the janitorial keycard from facilities. He walked the halls Clarice cleaned. He stood in the executive lounge, once a boardroom for the Commerce Bank. He closed his eyes and imagined the meetings that took place decades ago. Mortgage approvals marked in red ink. Neighborhoods carved by zip code and race. He didn't need imagination. History had already told the story. He found a plaque near the elevator, one he'd never noticed. It listed the original board of directors from the commerce era, a row of names, polished and proud. Half of them were names that had appeared in Clarice's folder. One was a name from Tobias's court file, a judge, later turned lobbyist. Another was listed on the Ronald Creed advisory memo. This wasn't a legacy. It was a lineage. He pulled out his phone and took a picture. Then he made a decision. The next day, he called an emergency board meeting. His team filed in, unaware. Some still adjusting their ties, sipping coffee. Shaq stood at the head of the table, Clarice's photo of Tobias placed before him. "We've been operating on a broken story," he said, voice calm but cold. "Our brand is built on smart tech and equity talk. But the concrete beneath us still echoes names we've allowed to vanish. That ends today." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He laid out every connection. George Monroe's disappearance, Tobias's wrongful conviction, the Apex Center's history, Ronald Creed's fingerprints. No one interrupted. When he finished, one executive leaned forward. "And what do you want us to do with this, Shaq?" He didn't blink. "We unbury every name. We issue a statement. We cut ties with any legacy firm still tied to that mess. We fund the creation of a civil rights documentation project, not just for the Monroes but for every erased name that passed through these buildings. And we engrave their names into the foundation." There was silence. Then slowly, a few nods. It wouldn't be easy. PR would spin. Lawyers would twitch. But none of that mattered now. Shaq wasn't fixing this for image. He was doing it because once a name is erased, history gets to lie. And he wasn't going to let it lie anymore. Not while he had a voice. Not while Clarice was still alive to hear it. Buried in a corporate basement was a file with blood on its pages. There were rooms in his empire even Shaq hadn't stepped into, spaces buried beneath tax documents, acquisition records, and decades of legal insulation. But now, his mission had shifted. He wasn't chasing profit margins or tech innovation anymore. He was chasing ghosts. And in that pursuit, he was willing to unseal doors meant to stay locked. The day began without ceremony. Shaq arrived at HQ before sunrise, dressed down in jeans and a plain thermal shirt. No entourage, no briefing. He met Darnell Briscoe, former NBA bruiser turned chief of internal operations, in the loading bay beneath the main tower. Darnell handed him a black keycard, his face unreadable. "You sure about this?" he asked. Shaq didn't blink. "If I'm going to tear this rot out, I need to start where it first took root." The entrance to the basement archive wasn't part of the building's blueprints. It had been repurposed from the foundation of the original banking structure that once stood here, long before it became Apex Center, before it belonged to Shaq. Only a handful of people even knew it existed. It was buried 2 floors below the parking level, accessed by freight elevator and biometric scan, the kind of place corporations forgot on purpose. The walls were bare concrete, the air sterile, faintly metallic. Lights flickered. Shaq's boots echoed as they stepped through the corridor. Most of the cabinets were coded by decade and acquisition date. The shelf they were looking for was marked, Archive Legacy Correspondence, 1969. Darnell stopped. "If anyone finds out we opened this without legal counsel." Shaq raised a hand. "I'll take the heat." They began digging. The file wasn't in a drawer labeled anything as obvious as Monroe. No, it was buried inside a dusty accordion folder labeled Employee Misconduct, Self-Surveillance, Disruption Protocols. Most of the documents inside were dull. Reports about time theft, early warnings about union activity, memos from middle managers reporting graffiti in restrooms. But near the back was a yellowing folder with a red paperclip. Shaq opened it. Inside was a typed memo dated April 1972, 6 weeks before George Monroe disappeared. It was brief, chillingly clinical. Subject: G. Monroe. Observation order. Per prior board discussion regarding internal agitators, we advise direct monitoring of subject George Monroe, attorney with connections to known activist groups. Use discretion. Record behavior. Submit incident reports to E. Hallstrom for review. Initial protocol approved. B. Langford. Shaq froze. B. Langford. That name still hung in the boardroom, not just in legacy files on the actual wall. A plaque commemorating the founders of the early real estate trust that evolved into Shaq's empire. Langford had been praised as a visionary financier. There was even a portrait of him on the 14th floor. Shaq felt his chest tighten. Darnell leaned over. "That's not just surveillance. That's a green light."
"And Hallstrom?" Shaq asked.
Legal head at the time. Died in 91. No kids. No footprint. They kept going. Beneath the memo were carbon copies of daily logs, strange notations like subject seen entering DBC office after hours, and subject's tone escalated during community speech. Recommend escalation of strategy. At the bottom of the stack was a brief typed report marked closed. It was dated May 19, 1972, the day after George Monroe disappeared. Shaq flipped the folder shut and exhaled, long and hard. They erased him by memo. But the horror wasn't over. Darnell reached for another stack nearby, marked Judicial Liaison/Partnership Materials. Inside were records of collaborative initiatives between private investors and judicial offices for building youth detention facilities. Backdoor deals that looked like civic service on paper, but read like barbed wire when you looked closer. One document stopped Shaq cold. A court testimony. It came from a man named Elijah Purnell, dated he was 17 at the time, serving time for a drug charge in the same facility as Tobias Monroe. The document wasn't supposed to be in this archive. It was misfiled, or maybe hidden here. Purnell had offered a statement claiming he witnessed the planting of narcotics in Tobias's locker by a school officer named Latchman. But the document had never been used in court. There was a note at the bottom, dismissed as hearsay per D.A.R. Creed. Shaq read the name again. Ronald Creed. There he was, again. The prosecutor who buried Tobias's case. The advisor who helped rebrand the Apex Center during its acquisition. The man who moved seamlessly from courtrooms to boardrooms to Capitol Hill, and now lived retired, wealthier than ever, in a private estate in Connecticut. Shaq looked at Darnell. This was never meant to see daylight. Darnell nodded. And Creed made sure of it. They scanned every page, every timestamp, every redacted name. By the time they surfaced, the sky outside had turned gray. The city was still moving, but Shaq felt like time had slowed. He wasn't just sitting on history anymore, he was holding a crime scene. In his office, Shaq laid the documents across a massive walnut table. Every corner represented a life dismantled. And yet this wasn't a courtroom. No judge would demand these files. No media outlet would beg for them. They had no legal obligation to be acknowledged. That was the genius of institutional silence. Plausible irrelevance. But Shaq didn't need a court ruling to know what was right. He called Clarice. This time, she picked up. I found something, he said. Her voice didn't ask what, it simply said, where. He told her everything. Langford's name on the memo, the daily logs, the closed file, and the buried testimony that never saw light. Silence followed, then a long breath. I knew it, she whispered. They put it in writing. They always do when they think no one will read it. He asked her if she wanted to see it, to hold it, to read what they wrote about her husband like he was a file number, not a man. No, she replied. I don't need to read the words that murdered him. I already lived them. Shaq nodded, even though she couldn't see. But I want you to do something, she added. Don't just bury this in another board meeting. Don't just issue a statement. Make it cost them something. Cost him something.
Creed?
Yes, she said. Him most of all. Shaq ended the call and stood at the window. The Apex Center gleamed in the distance, its mirrored exterior casting back the sky's fading light like armor. But now he knew what lay beneath. He contacted Raina Beckett, the investigative journalist known for exposing judicial corruption. He didn't send her a summary or a press release. He handed her the full files, unedited. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the records. Where did you get this? She whispered. From a building that pretended it didn't know the weight of its own walls. You realize this could bring Creed down? Shaq didn't flinch. Then I'm doing it right. Raina promised to move fast. Her team would verify, cross-reference, interview, and publish. Shaq didn't ask for control. He didn't want it. By the end of the week, the headline hit digital front pages nationwide. Secrets in the Walls, how a retired senator buried a family to build his career. Shaq didn't issue a personal statement. He let the facts speak. But behind the scenes, he instructed his board to remove every plaque bearing Langford's name from company properties. He announced the creation of the Monroe Justice Institute, with Clarice's name on every legal document. And quietly, he began funneling funding toward grassroots efforts aimed at overturning wrongful convictions, starting with those prosecuted under Creed's administration. The system hadn't expected someone like Shaq to go digging in its basement. But he had. And now, nothing would stay buried. When the truth screams, but the city wears earplugs, do you tear down the walls, or whisper louder? The city had a short memory by design. It praised progress in headlines, sold equality in marketing slogans. But beneath its steel and glass was the same spine it had always had, rigid, selective, built to forget the faces it couldn't market. Shaq knew this now, not in theory, in blood. When he launched the private legal team to investigate Tobias Monroe's conviction, he expected resistance from the outside. Political red tape, stonewalling agencies, outdated files buried under inaccessible tags. What he didn't expect was the pushback from within the empire he built. The legal team he assembled was small but surgical. 5 attorneys, 2 researchers, and a retired appellate judge turned consultant. They were given one task: go deep. No PR shielding, no respect for legacy silence. Their first month's findings were devastating. The narcotics found in Tobias Monroe's locker, there was no chain of custody documentation. The arresting officer, Latchman, had been investigated 3 years later for evidence tampering in another case. The key witness against Tobias? A student later identified as having received a scholarship tied to a community youth rehabilitation fund, chaired by none other than Ronald Creed. And the jury? Predominantly white in a district that was over 70% black. Records showed a pattern of black jurors being dismissed under cause for vague reasons like unemotional disposition or possible bias. It wasn't just a flawed trial, it was a performance scripted by fear and politics. Shaq sat through every briefing, fists clenched beneath the table. Clarice never joined. She didn't need to. Her presence had already lit the fuse. As the case unfolded, pressure within his own walls mounted. The first blow came from Victor Sorrell, a longtime executive and a man Shaq once called a mentor. They'd built 3 towers together, weathered 2 recessions, sat on panels about corporate ethics. Sorrell entered Shaq's office without knocking. "You're playing with fire," he said, tossing a tablet onto the desk. It displayed an early draft of the legal team's findings. Shaq didn't flinch. "I'm walking into fire. There's a difference." Sorrell leaned forward. "This doesn't just drag Creed through the mud. It links our company to systemic practices going back decades. You open this box and investors will bolt." "They already have," Shaq replied, "and they can keep walking." Sorrell's eyes narrowed. "You think you're untouchable. I know where the bones are buried, Shaquille. You want to play moral high ground. Fine. But I've got photos. From Miami, Vegas. A few nights the cameras didn't catch. You keep pushing this, I'll make sure your face is on the front page too, just with a different headline." Shaq stood slowly. He didn't yell. Didn't threaten. He just said, "You're not the first man to threaten a black man for telling the truth, but you'll be the last one to do it in my house." Sorrell left that day, resigned by morning. No public scandal, just silence. The city didn't want fireworks. It wanted plausible continuity. But the fracture was clear. Other executives began to murmur. Some wanted neutrality. Others demanded strategy over substance. Shaq listened. Then he made it clearer than ever. If you're in this building and you believe justice is optional, you're in the wrong building. He needed support from outside the power structure. Someone who wasn't tangled in corporate webs or nostalgic for the old way. That's when he made the call. Raina Beckett, 32 years old. Journalist, podcaster, social justice analyst. She was known for refusing interviews and digging until someone slammed the door in her face. Her reporting on prison profiteering had shut down a juvenile detention contract. Her expose on bank predatory practices made her both hated and hunted. But she didn't blink. She met Shaq at a public library conference room. No cameras. No assistants. "You don't need me to sell this story," she said. "It's already on fire." "I don't want you to sell it," Shaq said. "I want you to tell it. Without the lens. Without the fluff. Just tell people what they buried." Raina narrowed her eyes. "You mean what you buried?" He nodded. "Yeah, what we buried, and what we're about to dig up." She asked one question. "Do I have full access?" "Yes." "Even if it makes you look bad?" Shaq didn't hesitate, especially then. Raina dove in like a surgeon. She sat with Clarice Monroe for 3 hours without taking a single note. She reviewed the testimony files, court transcripts, and even requested permission to visit the juvenile facility where Tobias had once been held, now closed, rebranded, but still standing. She didn't spin tragedy into digestible heartbreak. She wrote it raw. Her first piece landed like a bomb. Tobias Monroe didn't just lose his freedom. We took his future and filed it away. The article trended within hours, but it wasn't the virality that mattered. It was the shift in tone. For the first time, the city looked back. People who had walked past the Apex Center daily without a second thought now paused at the lobby wall. Someone spray-painted a mural on the underpass near the original courthouse. A silhouette of Tobias with the words "erased but not forgotten." A former public defender tweeted the article with one line. "I remember this case. We weren't allowed to speak on it. But with the light came the shadows." Shaq received a formal inquiry from the State Commerce Board. Questions about fiduciary responsibility, corporate overreach, political interference. A watchdog group filed a motion to investigate internal conduct. An anonymous op-ed appeared in a business journal titled, "When CEOs Become Crusaders: How Activism Endangers the Free Market." He read it all, then kept moving. The truth had more momentum now than fear ever could. Meanwhile, Clarice remained grounded. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. When Shaq visited her apartment, she was folding clothes, the news report playing in the background. "They're talking about Tobias like they just discovered him," she said. Shaq nodded. Some of them did. She didn't look bitter, just tired. "I wonder what they'd say if he walked in today. What version of him they're mourning? The child? The convict? The cause?" "They're mourning what he could have been," Shaq said softly. Clarice shook her head. "Then they're still not listening." Shaq left that day with something deeper than fire, a responsibility not to just fight, but to understand who the fight was really for. By the end of the second month, pressure reached the mayor's office. Petitions surged. Law school forums reopened debate on judicial corruption. And in a move no one saw coming, a retired court clerk anonymously submitted a scan of a jury memo from Tobias's case, detailing concerns about evidence inconsistencies. It had never been entered into official record. The city was shifting. Not because it wanted to. Because it could no longer pretend it didn't know. Shaq stood on the rooftop of the Apex Center one night, looking out over the skyline. The same city that had raised him. The same city that had buried Tobias. The same city now being forced to listen. He knew this wasn't redemption. It wasn't closure. It was resistance. Not loud, not explosive, but persistent. Like Clarice's silence, like Tobias's smile in that fading photo, like the truth that refused to stay buried. And for the first time in his life, Shaq understood something deeper than winning. Some things were never meant to be shouted. They were meant to be heard. What if your empire was built on the broken bones of the righteous? The fallout began before the ink on the exposé dried. Within hours of Raina Beckett's piece going live, phones at corporate headquarters began ringing non-stop. Investors demanded meetings. Legal teams asked for statements. Shareholders sent emails with one subject line: crisis. Shaq sat alone in his office, shades drawn. The hum of the city muffled behind bulletproof glass. The walls around him displayed plaques of corporate milestones, press coverage, framed photos with heads of state and celebrities. They now felt hollow, celebratory notes from a song built on dissonance. He'd always believed his business was clean, but ignorance didn't absolve blood on the balance sheet. He opened his laptop and scanned the headlines again. Senator Creed implicated in cover-up of 1972 disappearance. Monroe family files suppressed. Link to Apex Empire uncovered. Justice deferred. How the system buried a civil rights family. There was no mention of Shaq's name yet. Raina had honored his request. He wasn't hiding, just not posturing. The spotlight wasn't for him. It was for the story, for the family that had been buried beneath decades of boardroom ambition and public forgetting. But not everyone appreciated the exposure. Within the first 48 hours, 3 board members called for an internal review. One major investor threatened to withdraw funding if Shaq didn't distance himself from politically charged narratives. A luxury resort deal was paused. Stock dipped 2.7%. Whispers began circulating about liability, brand erosion, executive instability. Shaq listened to it all in silence. He hadn't just stirred a hornet's nest. He'd shattered the illusion that power and decency could remain separated by polite contracts. Still, he didn't flinch. Not publicly, but privately, he needed to breathe. That night, he drove to his childhood home on the West End, a modest brick house still cared for by Lucille O'Neal. The porch light was always on, as if waiting for a part of him that still hadn't come home. Inside, his mother was making tea. She never hugged him when he walked in. She didn't have to. Her presence filled the room the way warmth fills a winter coat, steadily, silently, and without demand. "You look like you've seen too much truth," she said, not looking up from her kettle. "I did," Shaq replied, sitting at the old wooden table. "And I don't know what to do with it." Lucille poured the tea, then slid a mug toward him. "You do. You just don't like the cost." Shaq sighed. "If I take this public, it's not just Creed that burns. It's buildings, partnerships, thousands of jobs, everything we've built." Lucille finally looked at him, eyes firm. "And what happens if you don't? You keep your name clean while theirs stays erased. That's peace to you?" He didn't respond right away. She reached for an old photo on the shelf, a faded image of Shaq at age 8, standing next to a public housing project. His father had just left. His mother had 2 jobs. Shaq had already learned not to cry in public. "You built something good," Lucille said. "But sometimes the good thing ain't the right thing until it cost you something." Justice doesn't always pay, but peace does. Shaq nodded slowly. The words settled deep, like seeds in soil cracked wide open. The next morning, he called Clarice Monroe. This time, he didn't speak as a billionaire or a CEO. He asked to meet just the two of them. No press, no entourage. She agreed. The location? A park bench in the south corner of Marston Square, just off 39th Street, a place where her husband had once spoken to a small crowd about voting access. The day was clear. The bench was in shade. Clarice was already seated when he arrived, hands folded over her lap, posture still and composed. Shaq sat beside her, silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "I can give you anything," he said quietly. "A house, a settlement, a team of lawyers to sue every name on that list." Clarice looked ahead. "And what would that fix?" Shaq hesitated. "It'd give you comfort." "I'm not looking for comfort, Mr. O'Neal. I'm looking for closure." She turned to him, and the weight of her stare felt heavier than any courtroom verdict. "I don't need my husband's picture in some museum. I don't need pity. I want one thing. Before I die, I want my son's name cleared. I want his record wiped, publicly. I want the world to know he wasn't a criminal. He was the son of a man they couldn't silence, so they broke the next best thing." Shaq nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." They sat in silence again. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above. "Do you believe he's dead?" Shaq finally asked. Clarice's voice was steady. "I believe he's somewhere too broken to come back from. That's death, even if there's no coffin." Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a new resolve. He had tried to fix the past through spreadsheets and donations. But this wasn't about checks or construction. This was about restoration. By the end of the week, he had assembled a legal task force, former prosecutors, public defenders, civil rights lawyers, all sworn to secrecy, all funded out of Shaq's personal wealth. Their task was clear: reopen the case of Tobias Monroe, petition the state for a posthumous exoneration, and make the process public, not symbolic, permanent. Raina Beckett agreed to document it all, but this time with Clarice's permission. Meanwhile, the backroom pressure mounted. 3 corporate partners withdrew from their development projects. One international investor issued a public statement condemning Shaq's reckless politicization of business. His board scheduled a private meeting to discuss leadership stability. He was told that continued action could cost billions in valuation. He didn't flinch. In a closed-door board session, he stood in front of a table full of polished men and women with designer watches and legal armor, and said, "I built this company so people like me didn't have to ask for a seat. I didn't build it to become the kind of man who forgets why he needed the seat in the first place. If this costs us comfort, then maybe comfort was the problem." Some clapped. Others stayed silent. One resigned that night. Shaq didn't stop. The application for posthumous exoneration was filed. State officials responded cautiously, but Raina's reporting had gone viral. Citizens started petitions. Youth groups held vigils. Across the city, murals of Tobias began to appear, paint reclaiming silence. Clarice never asked for updates. She just showed up once a week, sitting in the back of the courtroom, when the legal team presented new evidence. She never spoke, but the presence of her quiet grief changed the temperature of the room. And slowly the tide began to shift. A retired judge came forward, admitting that the original trial was expedited under community pressure. A former juror broke silence in a local interview, confessing they were told what verdict would be most beneficial to the city's image. Evidence of falsified testimony surfaced, and Ronald Creed, he released a carefully worded denial through his attorney. But the damage was done. The truth was louder now than any press release. As Shaq stood outside the courthouse on the day the petition was accepted for formal review, he looked out over a crowd of strangers holding photos of a boy whose life had been erased. They didn't know Tobias. They didn't know George. But they knew what injustice looked like, and they were tired of pretending it was history. Clarice stood beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He had given her what she asked for. And in doing so, had finally understood what it meant to use power, not to preserve comfort, but to dismantle the architecture of forgetting. 50 years too late, and still the courtroom didn't feel safe. The courtroom wasn't large, but it felt cavernous that morning, as if the weight of what had gone unspoken for decades had hollowed the place out. There were no grand speeches, no cameras allowed inside, just quiet tension, the rustle of paper, and the echo of chairs as people filed in, unsure of what justice would look like after half a century. Shaq sat in the back, alone. No suit, no entourage. Just a quiet, immovable figure with hands folded and eyes sharp, letting the truth sit in the space that power usually occupied. This wasn't his stage. It belonged to a woman who had lost more than any courtroom could ever account for, and the son she might never bury, but could finally lift. Clarice Monroe entered through the side, guided gently by Raina Beckett. She looked smaller than she had weeks ago. Time had accelerated for her, not in years, but in emotional wear. Her steps were steady, but her shoulders sagged just slightly, as if the burden she'd carried alone for so long was finally being shared, but not yet lifted. She took her seat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, a simple black shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't look at anyone, not even Shaq. Her focus was on the bench. At the front of the room sat Judge Helena Corrigan, a firm, pragmatic woman known for avoiding media and staying grounded in procedure. She had reviewed hundreds of appeals during her career, but this one was different. This wasn't about technicalities. It was about ghosts, about whether the law could finally acknowledge what the people had already accepted, that Tobias Monroe had been wronged, not by one bad cop or one flawed trial, but by a system designed to dispose of boys like him. The petition to vacate Tobias's conviction had been filed 6 weeks earlier. It had passed quietly through review panels, supported by new evidence, sworn statements, and public pressure that had grown into an undeniable force. Raina's articles, now published in national syndication, had cracked the narrative wide open. What had once been a buried injustice was now a case study in systemic failure. But even with all of that, no one in the courtroom felt safe. The past had claws, and the city still bore its scars. The hearing opened with procedural remarks. A young attorney from Shaq's legal team, Eli Jamison, presented the new findings, the coerced testimony, the disqualified jurors, the missing memo from the court clerk, and the verified misconduct of Officer Latchman, who had since disappeared from public record. There was no defense team present. The state had declined to challenge the petition, citing compelling and overwhelming new evidence. But Judge Corrigan was methodical. She needed to hear everything, officially. It wasn't just about legal record. It was about acknowledging the weight of erasure. Then came the unexpected moment. As Jamison wrapped his argument, a figure stood from the third bench, an older man in a frayed jacket, his hand trembling as he raised it. "I need to speak," he said, voice cracking. Corrigan looked up. "You are?" "My name is Luther Parrish. I was the witness who testified against Tobias Monroe." The room stilled. Jamison turned. Raina looked up from her notebook. Shaq straightened. Parrish stepped forward slowly. His hands trembled, but his voice found its shape as he stood at the center of the room. "I was 15 back then," he said. "I was scared. They brought me into a back room at the precinct. Told me if I didn't say what they wanted, my brother would get arrested for something he didn't do. They told me Tobias was already guilty, that it didn't matter what I said, but it would go better for me if I cooperated." Clarice inhaled sharply. "I've lived with that lie for 50 years, Parrish continued, voice shaking. "I knew he was innocent. I saw the look on his face when they read the verdict. He didn't cry. He just stopped existing. I never saw him again. I never forgave myself." Judge Corrigan nodded. "Are you willing to submit a formal affidavit under penalty of perjury?" "I already have," Parrish said, pulling a folder from his coat. "And I'm ready to testify again. Truthfully this time." Corrigan accepted the file, read a portion of it aloud, then turned to Clarice. "Mrs. Monroe," she said gently, "do you wish to speak today?" Clarice shook her head. She rose slowly from her seat, eyes fixed on the judge. "I've waited 50 years for you to say what I already knew," she said. "My son wasn't a threat. He was a boy. A good boy. You can say the word now. You can clear his name. But it won't give me back the birthdays, the graduations, the letters that stopped coming." Her voice didn't shake. It sliced. "I'm not asking you for sympathy. I'm asking you for the truth." Judge Corrigan folded her hands. "This court acknowledges the overwhelming evidence that Tobias Monroe's conviction was the result of a fundamentally flawed judicial process, rife with misconduct, racial bias, and intentional suppression of exculpatory testimony. The court hereby vacates the conviction of Tobias Monroe in full and declares him posthumously innocent." The words echoed, but no applause followed. No cheers, just silence. Heavy, full. Clarice closed her eyes. One tear escaped. She whispered, barely audible, "Now he can rest." Shaq stood in the back, heart heavy but lifted. He had delivered nothing that could restore Tobias's life, but he had carved a space in time where his name was no longer buried beneath suspicion and silence. As the courtroom emptied, Raina remained seated, scribbling a final note. Clarice approached Parrish at the front. He opened his mouth to apologize, but she placed a hand on his arm. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but don't waste the rest of your life trying to undo the past. Use it, make them remember. Outside, the city looked different. It wasn't brighter, just clearer. A crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps. Journalists, activists, strangers holding signs with Tobias's name. No one chanted. They just stood in quiet defiance of forgetting. Shaq emerged last, flanked by no one. He didn't wave, didn't speak. He simply walked to Clarice, who stood at the top of the steps, looking not at the crowd, but up toward the sky that had held her pain for too long. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. Clarice nodded. "I'm just glad someone finally listened." That night, news anchor spoke her son's name. Not as a statistic, but as a son, a student, a victim of something far bigger than one bad verdict. And somewhere in a dark room filled with files and broken stories, a name long forgotten was etched back into the world. Not through vengeance, but through truth. Truth doesn't ask for permission before walking into the room. The room was polished, temperature-controlled, and lined with the silent power of generational money. It smelled of leather chairs, imported wood, and the kind of restraint that cost millions to maintain. The quarterly shareholder meeting had always been a formality. Nods, slides, financial forecasts, and applause for market dominance. But today, the script had been incinerated before anyone entered the room. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the head of the table, not in tailored silk or a corporate gray suit, but in a dark jacket with a single pin on the lapel, a brass outline of Tobias Monroe's face. It was a bold gesture in a room where subtlety had always ruled, where wealth had been quiet and conscience quieter. The board members shifted uncomfortably as the room filled. Several key investors sat flanked by assistants, whispering nervously about stock volatility and public perception. A few kept their eyes on their tablets, scrolling through real-time analytics as if data could outpace conscience. The room buzzed low with apprehension, but no one spoke over Shaq. They never had to. His presence alone commanded silence. When he finally did speak, it wasn't with a prepared statement or projected chart. It was with something heavier, a printed file, held in both hands, worn at the edges, its pages marked with tabs and underlined in red. "This," he said, lifting it, "is the file we were never supposed to see. It contains the names of men who built this company, who sat in rooms like this one and decided who got erased and who got rich. George Monroe, Tobias Monroe. Their lives were dismantled while we constructed boardwalks and glass towers on the foundations of silence." The room held its breath. No one moved. "I've spent the last 6 months digging into our history," Shaq continued, "and I found proof that one of our buildings, the Apex Center, was not just built on the literal footprint of a redline banking institution, but also advised by Ronald Creed, the same man who buried Tobias Monroe's life under a false conviction." There was a murmur at the mention of Creed, not surprise but discomfort. It was one thing to whisper his name in legal strategy calls. It was another to say it here, out loud, with the eyes of history watching. Shaq stepped away from the table and activated the presentation screen. But instead of a corporate slideshow, the screen filled with scanned memos, internal communications, and photographs, including the memo signed by B. Langford authorizing surveillance of George Monroe in 19... "I know some of you would rather this stay buried," he said. "I know others are wondering what the financial fallout will be. But if your primary concern is stock price while we stand on a pile of systemic injustice, you're welcome to cash out today." No one interrupted him. One investor, an older man with a silver tie clip and the last name Harmon, raised a slow hand. "If we let this narrative take hold, it could spiral. Public confidence, partners, asset management. Are you proposing we reposition the entire company around guilt?" Shaq locked eyes with him. "I'm not proposing guilt. I'm proposing responsibility." He stepped back to the head of the table, voice steady. "Starting today, our company will allocate 10% of annual profits to fund the creation of a permanent reparative justice institute named after Clarice Monroe. It will provide legal defense for wrongfully convicted youth, support community-led urban development, and sponsor historical truth commissions across all major U.S. cities where systemic erasure has occurred." A few gasps, a scoff from the far end of the table. A woman whispered to her assistant, who immediately began typing into her phone. Shaq continued, "This is not a gesture. This is not branding. This is structural realignment. We'll revisit every real estate deal from our past 2 decades. Every one. If we find evidence that marginalized communities were displaced by our expansion, we will commit to reinvestment, not charity, but long-term stakeholding in those neighborhoods." A younger board member leaned in. "You're talking about billions in reversals. I'm talking about billions in clarity." Another man, Wexler, head of global strategy, crossed his arms. "And who gets to decide what was unjust? The past is complex, Shaq. You go too far back and no one's hands are clean. Shaq leaned forward. Then let the ones who aren't afraid of dirt step forward. I'd rather lose deals than lose my reflection. There it was. The moment. The line that separated the room. 3 investors quietly stood and walked out. They didn't slam doors or shout, just left, without eye contact. Their chairs sat empty for the rest of the meeting. Shaq didn't flinch. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was a clearing. He looked around the table, gaze steady. For too long we've been a company that profited from a version of the American story that never made room for the truth. That ends now. I will not lead a business that can't look its own history in the face. He gestured toward the wall, a mural of innovation, a timeline of growth. Every name up there was once praised for building something. But none of those men ever asked who was crushed beneath it. We will. The screen shifted. Now it displayed a render of the new Clarice Monroe Institute. An open, sunlit structure with stained glass timelines of erased civil rights cases and an amphitheater designed for public hearings. This building will sit 2 blocks from Apex Center. The ground it stands on was once a block torn apart by eviction policy. We're buying it back, and we're giving it to the people. There was no applause. Just stillness. Until finally, one voice from a young woman, 2 seats from the end, the newest board member, barely 30, spoke up. My grandfather was displaced during the 1974 clearance. He never made it back. I never knew why. I do now. Thank you. It broke the tension. A few nods, a breath. Even Wexler leaned back, no longer posturing, just watching. Shaq exhaled. Later that day, headlines rolled out. Big Shaq acknowledges company's ties to historic injustice, launches reparative justice arm. CEO O'Neal rewrites corporate doctrine. Equity, not erasure. The Clarice Monroe Institute. Justice engraved in glass and stone. Stock did dip, but the fall wasn't steep. And it was followed by a surprising rebound. Youth organizations began posting the new render across social media. Activists rallied behind the institute. A viral video showed a group of teenagers spray painting Tobias Monroe's name, not in protest but in tribute. Beneath it the words "not forgotten, not again." Shaq returned to the boardroom a week later. The mural timeline on the wall had changed. In place of the sanitized names and glossed-over triumphs was a new plaque, metal, not gold, but steel. It read, "Here once stood silence. Now stands truth." The woman who cleaned the floor beneath giants now had a place among legends. It was a Wednesday morning when the call came. The voice on the other end was gentle, measured, but final. Clarice Monroe had passed in her sleep the night before. No pain, no hospital monitors, no last-minute panic. Just stillness, just peace. The kind of passing you might imagine for a woman who had waited her entire life for the world to finally say her son's name with reverence instead of suspicion. Shaq sat with the silence for a long while after hanging up the phone. His fingers curled around the armrest of the leather chair in his office, but his gaze didn't leave the window. The afternoon light spilled through the glass in long golden streaks, hitting the floor exactly where Clarice used to mop every Thursday. And though she was gone, he could still feel her there. Not like a ghost, like a presence that had always belonged. The funeral was held 3 days later, in a community church that seated barely 200, yet hundreds more stood outside. There were no luxury cars, no press cordons, no velvet ropes, just people, faces from every walk of life, cafeteria workers in scrubs, former inmates in crisp suits, children holding printed signs that read, "She never stopped cleaning because they never stopped erasing." Inside the church, the air was thick with reverence, not sorrow. A choir hummed softly. Photographs of Clarice lined the walls, not just the younger woman with her husband and son, but the quiet warrior who had scrubbed the dust of injustice from boardrooms and government buildings alike. When Shaq stepped up to the podium, he didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. He looked out at the sea of faces, then down at the small flower-covered casket that held not just a woman, but a history. "She didn't ask for your spotlight," he said. "She carried a flashlight through your dark rooms instead. She knew your systems before your systems knew her. And when you forgot her name, she held tight to the ones you tried to erase." He paused, his voice low and steady. "She outlived the men who erased her husband. She outlasted the systems that tried to bury her son. And somehow, she still made room for grace. Not once did she ask for revenge. Only truth, only remembrance." A murmur of agreement rolled through the pews. Shaq continued. "I once asked her what justice looked like. She said, 'It's not a courtroom or a headline. It's a name that doesn't need to be whispered anymore.'" He nodded softly, eyes misted, lips pressed together. Tobias Monroe is no longer a ghost. George Monroe is no longer an asterisk. And Clarice Monroe, she was never a janitor. She was the one person who made sure we cleaned more than our floors. She made sure we cleaned our conscience. When he stepped down, no one applauded. They stood in silence, every person, as if stillness was the only thing sacred enough to match what they had just witnessed. The service spilled out into the courtyard. Old civil rights leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with teenage organizers. A university president handed Shaq a sealed envelope, a proposal to name their new social justice curriculum after Clarice. A historian asked to begin work on a biography. A documentary crew from PBS requested exclusive rights to her life story. Shaq turned them all down that day. Not out of disrespect, but because he knew Clarice would have hated the spectacle. She didn't live for legacy, he told them. She lived so the rest of us could have one. Back at headquarters, a quiet change had taken place. The janitorial closet on the 16th floor, the one Clarice always used, had been cleared, scrubbed, and converted into a small reflection room. Its walls were lined with framed quotes from the Monroe case files. Her cleaning cart stood preserved behind glass, untouched, not as a museum piece, but as a reminder that sometimes the hands holding the mop know more about the world than the ones holding the mic. In Shaq's office, something new appeared. A chair. It was an antique armchair, not expensive, but meaningful. Worn green leather, low enough to catch the afternoon sun just right. He placed it by the window, in the spot Clarice had once paused at the end of each shift, always just for a moment, as if gathering herself before re-entering the world. It sat empty now, and it would stay that way. Not out of grief, out of honor. Some staff whispered about it, unsure why it remained. Others instinctively lowered their voices when they passed by. A few began referring to it as Miss Monroe's chair, without being told. Eventually, even new hires heard the story, not as policy, but as inheritance. That year, when the Clarice Monroe Institute broke ground, Shaq was asked to cut the ribbon. He declined. Instead, he invited a group of high school students from East Jefferson, the same neighborhood where Clarice once lived. They cut the ribbon together, hands wrapped around the scissors, wide-eyed, surrounded by murals of Tobias, George, and Clarice. Inside the main atrium of the institute, engraved across the upper beam, were the words she once said in a whisper. "Let my son rest." Shaq stood beneath those words and let the silence speak for itself. Months passed. The company changed. Public perception shifted. But that chair, it never moved. Sometimes, in late afternoons, Shaq would sit across from it, just for a few minutes. No calls, no meetings, no agendas, just memory. And in those moments, he didn't see a billionaire or a CEO staring out the window. He saw a woman who had spent 50 years cleaning a country that never said thank you. And he made a silent promise to her, again and again. "You will never be erased. Not while I'm still here." Sometimes, following someone home is the only way to find your way back. By the time the fiscal year closed, Shaq's company had broken 2 records, not in revenue, though the numbers held strong, but in social impact. The board had voted unanimously to embed reparative justice metrics into the company's success indicators. Shareholder reports now included impact statements, not just earnings. On spreadsheets once filled with market forecasts and expansion targets, new columns appeared, communities reinvested, records expunged, names restored. It wasn't trendy, it was deliberate, and it began with a question. Not to a boardroom, to a janitor. Clarice Monroe had asked for one thing, for her son's name to breathe again. What followed was a company transformed, and a man reborn through something far rarer than ambition: listening. The Clarice Monroe Institute was fully operational by spring. Students wandered its hallways where digital timelines told the stories of forgotten families. Archived files were made public, and legal fellows took on cases that had once slipped between the cracks. The first conviction overturned under its banner was a man named Ezra Colton, sentenced in 1991 at the age of 16, released in 2025. He left prison and walked straight into the Institute's main hall, tears blurring his eyes beneath a skylight shaped like a broken gavel. Shaq stood in the back during the ceremony, out of frame, hands clasped, eyes low. He didn't want praise. He wanted permanence. A year after Clarice's passing, the company launched the Monroe Fellowship, a national grant for investigative journalists and legal scholars focused on cases of racial injustice, wrongful imprisonment, and structural disenfranchisement. Raina Beckett, now the program's director, helped select the first cohort. Among the fellows was a former public school teacher, a data analyst from Atlanta, and a 19-year-old whose brother had been wrongly arrested in their place. The movement wasn't loud anymore. It was rooted. Shaq also pushed beyond the walls of policy. Across the city, in parks and courthouses and corporate plazas, monuments once dedicated to economic pioneers and military heroes were replaced or recontextualized. He partnered with artists to design memorials that honored the untold stories, not just of George and Tobias Monroe, but of people whose names had faded into footnotes. There was no plaque that bore Shaq's name. Instead, each one was stamped with the words, "Because they lived, we remember." In East Jefferson, where Tobias once walked to school and Clarice once folded laundry by moonlight, Shaq funded the rebuilding of a public library. Inside, a room was named the listening room, not for audio, but for conversation. Anyone could enter, sit, and tell their story. No credentials required. No credentials allowed. It became a sanctuary for those whose voices had been tuned out for generations. The media, of course, tried to crown him. From court to conscience, how Big Shaq is reshaping corporate America. The billionaire who listened. Shaquille O'Neal's quiet revolution. He answered none of them. When asked by a reporter why he remained so removed from the spotlight, he smiled gently and said, "Because this story doesn't end with me. It started with someone the world ignored." He kept Clarice's chair in his office, still by the window, still empty. Every afternoon, the sun poured onto it like clockwork. And every so often, Shaq would sit across from it with a notepad in hand. He wasn't writing reports. He was writing questions. Questions he never got to ask her. Questions he'd ask others now. Questions that started movements, not meetings. There was no final victory. No speech where the curtain dropped and justice was declared finished. The work stretched ahead like a road that curved past the horizon. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of shame. It was the silence that follows when someone truly listens. One day, walking out of the Clarice Monroe Institute, Shaq was stopped by a girl no older than 12. She wore a backpack too big for her frame and held a notebook covered in hand-drawn graffiti letters. She asked, "Are you the guy who followed the cleaning lady?" Shaq paused, then nodded. "I heard she made you see things different," she said. "She did," he replied. The girl smiled. "Then I think I'll be one too."
One what?
"One of the people who make people see things different." She ran off before he could respond. Shaq watched her disappear into a crowd of students. The next voices, the next fighters, the next listeners. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The legacy of listening wasn't about fame or justice served late. It was about planting a question so deep in the hearts of others that they couldn't ignore it either. That was Clarice's power. That was Tobias's echo. And that was Shaq's inheritance. Not wealth, not applause, but a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is follow someone forgotten and ask the one question that changes everything. What happened to you? If this story moved you, don't let it end at the credits. Ask whose name was erased in your city. Look at the walls, the streets, the silence, and ask what it's hiding. Justice doesn't just live in courts. It lives in choices, in memory, in who we choose to hear. Because sometimes the most powerful